Welcome back to another edition of Commissioner's Corner. I'm County Commissioner Josh Brown. As usual, I'm with Shar Burnett from BCAT. Welcome.
Thank you, Josh. Good to be here with you. We've got a few topics to talk about. First of all, let's share some video that we have from the Greaves Way opening. Big project for the city, first road project in numerous years. Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, we broke ground about a year ago on the Greaves Way project, and at the time we called it the Waga Way Extension.
Right.
And then we went through a community road naming process where the county and our Central Kitsap Community Council, working with the Central Kitsap Reporter, had a road naming contest. Greaves Way was the road that was selected. We're really excited about this project because this road not only serves as a northern bypass to Silverdale, so if you're coming into Silverdale from Seebeck off Anderson Hill Road, instead of having to cut over by the high school to get to the post office or get to the north part of town, this is a pretty easy access to hit a different part of town. But what's also important about this project is the fact that this boulevard runs right through several hundred acres that was added to the urban growth area in 2006. The land is zoned commercial and industrial, and it's an area where we see a lot of future economic development taking place. So it's wedged between
and
a couple.
It looks very nice. Sidewalked, really nice street lights. It is a very nice project. Looks really good.
We have some great landscaping, lighting, sidewalks. It's really a first-class road. And I think what you've seen the county try to do is when we take on different road projects in our urban growth areas, I think of Lindvog up in Kingston and some of the projects that we did up in Kingston a few years ago, and now this project in Silverdale. We're really trying to make sure that these projects are done well up front so that they have a lasting impact and they really improve the community. So we're excited about it and gotten a lot of great feedback, and I think people are glad the road's finally open.
Yeah.
So it's a big achievement for us.
Good. Another big project that was in the works and affecting the Seebeck area is the Big Beef Bridge. Tell us about that.
Well, you know, every year, and it's a bit on a rolling basis, we have our county inspectors go out to all of our bridges and culverts, and we have scores of bridges and culverts throughout the county. And it's really important that we go out and do these annual inspections. Sometimes we inspect more than once a year, depending on how old the infrastructure is and what we found last time. But we do that to make sure that the bridges and culverts that we have in the county inventory are still safe. And when we were out at Big Beef Bridge a few months ago, just on a routine inspection, that inspection revealed that the bridge was undermined. And that bridge, if you're out there ever, it's right in a saltwater estuary off of Hood Canal. You got a lot of debris in that area, and what had happened was a large tree had fallen into the estuary, was pulled out into Hood Canal, and when it was being pulled out into Hood Canal just through the out tide, it knocked into the edge of the bridge and got stuck in the abutment and undermined the bridge. So when I had gone out there with our county engineer, John Brand, the day after we closed the road, and we had to do an emergency road closure because it was a serious situation. When I was out there the next morning to actually see what had happened, we had a gap in the road that was about this wide.
Wow.
And it was a gap between where the bridge hits the abutment and the actual foundation of the abutment. And what we needed to do was essentially cut out that portion of the abutment and completely redo the foundation work. So we had to go in, pull up a lot of concrete and compacted soil for the abutment and completely fix that project. But that's a good example, I think, of our Public Works Department really taking prevention seriously. And we all know the expression, of an ounce of prevention, really helps you out and gives you a pound of results. Well, I think that's a good instance of that. So we do that every year throughout all of our bridges and culverts, and it was definitely an inconvenience for a few days for the residents of Seebeck, the fact that we had that bridge closed. But I guarantee if we wouldn't do those inspections, and if that bridge would have just collapsed, we could have definitely risked property and life. but it would have been a project that would have taken literally many months. To complete. So.
Staying out in Seebeck, the Marina Project is underway, and how's that project going?
Well, it's back on track. So, you know,
that's good.
So a year ago, the county took action. We amended our shoreline master plan so that the Marina Project could move forward. And, you know, when I became commissioner in 2007, I had many people tell me that this project was never going to get the permits necessary to rebuild the marina. It has all the permits, and it's had all the permits needed to move forward for the better part of the last year. Of course, at the same time that all the permits were received by the developer of the new Seebeck Marina, the economy slowed down, and financing became harder to acquire. So the economy really slowed that project down. The developers wanted to move forward with the project because they really see this as the only window of time that they would be able to go in and actually rebuild the marina. And at the same time that they were actually out demolishing the old marina, doing pile driving for the new, they ran into a situation where the lease for the land that they thought they had controlled on DNR property, the lease wasn't properly enforced. And I guess a way to characterize it is, you know, if you're renting an apartment and you want to move out of your apartment and you want to assign the lease to your best friend, the landlord has a say of whether or not you can assign that lease. Well, when the property was bought by the current owners of the Seebeck Marina from the previous owner, the thought was that the lease on the DNR tidelands went with that sale, and they didn't. You couldn't assign that lease. So we had gone down to Olympia. I accompanied the owners of the marina. We met with our legislators, we met with DNR, and really to DNR's credit, they stepped up to the plate and they came up with a solution that allowed the project to move forward. So my hat's off to them, and you know, we're excited that when we have the next fish window open up so that they can do more pile driving, they're going to get the pile driving done, and we're going to see over the course of the summer that Marina Project come together and realize. So we're very excited. And it means so much to the community in Seebeck because
yes, it does.
You know, the Seebeck Elementary School was closed a couple years ago. The marina hasn't been operating for several years now. And I think the community really looks at this Marina Project as a very vital and integral part of their community, that when it's rebuilt and when people are coming back down to Seebeck in the summertime and enjoying using a facility like that, taking their boats out, going shrimping in the canal, it's going to, I think, really bring back some, you know, some special quality to the community. So.
Yeah. Josh, we know that the county's working always on their budget, and the commissioner's focus is to have the county on a strong financial foot, and some of that includes working with its bargaining units. How are things developing in that area?
Well, Kitsap County, we have about 20 different bargaining units. That's a lot.
Huge.
So, you know, if you look at our cities, you know, many cities might have roughly 5 bargaining units. Well, we have about 20 at the county. And we have total about 1,200 employees at Kitsap County. When I took office in 2007, and Commissioner Bauer was appointed county commissioner in July of 2007, we inherited 3-year contracts with essentially all of our bargaining units. Those 3-year contracts were signed in 2006 by the previous Board of County Commissioners. So we inherited them as we inherited a budget in 2007 from our predecessors. Those contracts affected 2007, 2008, 2009. And really, our ability to manage the county's financial position was restricted to those contracts. You know, when you have a contract in force, the county can't unilaterally break it.
Right.
You have a signed 3-year contract and you've agreed to those terms. So we didn't have the flexibility that we necessarily wanted. We made a conscious decision that as these contracts were all rolling over, essentially on the same timeline, that beginning this year, 2010, now that all these contracts are open, that the county would methodically work through a process to figure out what kind of financial game plan we need to implement moving forward. And to give you a sense of where the county was and where we need to go, before this recession took effect, the county was bringing in roughly 4% growth in revenues a year. And of course, what we rely upon significantly is property tax and sales tax. Sales tax grows at a good rate when the economy is strong, but because we have a 1% property tax limitation in the state, property tax doesn't grow as fast as sales tax. When the economy was good, combined revenues, property, sales tax, fines, forfeitures, all of our other accounts in the general fund, were growing a little less than 4% a year. It was about 3.8, 3.9. Our expenditures, however, of which over 2/3 is salaries and benefits, was growing about 6% a year. So we had a slope problem, as we call it at the county. We had our revenues growing at this slope, but our expenditures were growing at this slope. And that gap between the slopes was at about 2% a year. Now, 2% may not seem like a lot, but when you're trying to figure what 2% is and your budget is about $80 million a year, 2% of $80 million is $1.6 million. So to keep the same amount of employees, to keep the same amount of prosecutors, corrections officers, deputies, public works staff, parks employees, to keep the same infrastructure and the same service levels to serve our community of about 250,000 people, to just keep doing the same stuff, we needed to cut about $1.6 million a year, every year, just to keep the same service levels. Now, I think you look at that, and I think it's pretty clear that that's not sustainable. Now, that was when times were very good. When the housing market was a bubble, and there was a lot of construction, and a lot of sales tax money coming in because people were refinancing their houses and pulling out equity and buying new cars, electronics, home improvements. We're in a very different place today. And while I think we're past the trough of the recession, we know that as the economy recovers, this will probably be much slower and not as generous as a recovery as perhaps other recoveries. You know, you can look at the recession during the early 90s. That was a pretty quick end to that recession, and it was a pretty robust recovery. I think things are going to be not as robust this time around. That's what you're hearing throughout the nation. So the task before the commissioners is, if we know that in really good times our revenues were growing a little less than 4% a year, I can pretty much assure you that for the next 5, the next 7, the next 10 years, as you know, as the economy recovers, our revenues are probably going to grow less than that. And I can't tell you at this time whether that number should be 2% or 3% or 2.7% revenue growth. What I can tell you is it's going to be less than what it was in the boom years. It's going to be less than that, roughly 4%. And if it's at 3%, that may not seem like a big drop, but that's a reduction of 25%. So the first task we have as a county, and working with our executive team, is figuring out what can we project growth to be over the next 5 to 7 years. What is that revenue stream? And then working our way backwards, if our revenue stream, and just for example's sake, if instead of 4% it's 3% a year, then what we need to be able to do is negotiate contracts that are within spitting distance of that revenue stream. Our old contracts that were growing 6% a year, that's not sustainable. What is sustainable is something much more in line with our revenue source. And it might be the case that, you know, as hard as we push in terms of implementing new contracts, we may be in a position where the county just can't get to that point. And a good example is the fact that, you know, for the vast majority of our employees, the county commissioners can implement what salaries and benefits are. But for a couple hundred of our employees, our sheriff's deputies and our corrections officers, those bargaining units have binding arbitration. So if those bargaining units don't like what the county commissioners are proposing, we cannot unilaterally implement what a cost of living adjustment is or what the health care costs are. We can be taken to arbitration, and under state law, that arbitrator gets to determine what the salary and benefits are for that adjustment. And if it comes back and that arbitrator rules that the number is a lot higher than what we can afford, I think pretty clearly, you know, there's no free lunch in life. That money's going to have to come from somewhere. And I think what we're going to say is it's going to have to come out of that budget. And if that means a reduction in force to be able to meet those compensation levels, then
From that bargaining unit.
Right, from that bargaining unit, then that's what we're going to be left with. So,
Josh, does the county like to work on the contracts with bargaining units all in the same year? That is a huge amount of work.
yeah.
You can understand, since all the contracts are going to come up at the same time,
Right.
working together to get them all done, then you have more time to spend on other things. But that is a huge amount of contracts
Yeah.
to work on. Is that historically how the county does negotiations?
Well, I wouldn't say it's a historical norm, but we've positioned ourselves to do this. And in fairness to all of our employees, remember, in our general fund, we have 70% of our general fund is corrections, or pardon me, is criminal justice functions. And then we have
Okay.
general government functions like our auditor, planning, the assessor, et cetera. But then outside of that general fund, we have public works.
Right.
And we have a road fund that funds our road portion of public works, and then we have a sewer account, which is paid for by utility rates, and then we have a stormwater account, which is paid for by utility rates.
Right, right.
Well, you could kind of drive yourself crazy in terms of having to figure out what your revenue source is for all these groups individually. And since the commissioner set the utility rates for the sewer utility and the stormwater utility, I guess you could make the argument that the revenue stream is dependent on who the commissioners are. But in reality, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the general fund, because the general fund reflects the county's overall financial picture. And it shows the limitations of property tax, it shows the limitations of sales tax collections. And we're going to use that as our model to be able to determine what this revenue stream is. And whatever that percentage is, then we're going to say that's the percentage for the entire county that we're going to try to live within. And we're not going to try to treat some of our public works employees differently from our folks in the general fund.
Good.
And I think that's fair
Yeah.
across the organizational spectrum. But we've taken this on because, you know, to your question about, is this a lot of work? Absolutely. But this is the work that we've been positioning the county to do so that we're in a strong financial position and that we have a financial game plan that's sustainable. And that's the tough work that wasn't done several years ago when these contracts were adopted in 2006. And I think what you see from the county is that we are, I think, going to be the model in terms of how do you have sustainable funding for local government here, not only in Kitsap County, but in the, in the region or maybe even in the state. And I think you're beginning to see some of our cities even talking about some of the things that the county's already doing. I had a meeting with a few city council members today, and we're just talking about financial issues, and they said, now what is the county doing? And I explained this whole process, and they said, well, those are things we're thinking about doing. And I think, it's a lot of work, but we're excited about it because this is the major policy work the commissioners do. The budget is the major policy document we adopt every year, and we want to ensure that the financial picture we leave to future boards of county commissioners is stronger and better than what was left to us.
Good.
So,
excellent. Well, let's take a break.
Absolutely. Let's take a break and we'll catch up with everybody here in a few minutes. Welcome back to Commissioner's Corner. Shar, I think you have a few more tough questions for me.
A few more topics.
All right.
Let's talk about stormwater funding. That seems to be important.
Absolutely. One of our big legislative priorities this year was encouraging the state to establish for the first time a sustainable financial source to be able to fund grants for local governments in order to put in place stormwater improvements throughout our county. So let me put things a little bit in perspective. The county has a stormwater utility fund. Our budget every year is about $7 million. We put about $2 million in from our county road fund, and then the remainder of that, the bulk of that money is raised through an assessment on property owners. So today our stormwater assessment is about $70 a year. It varies by jurisdiction. I think on Bainbridge Island, I think the average rate is $150 or $160 a year. But we use that money in order to help clean up Puget Sound and implement policies that reduce stormwater runoff. So what is stormwater? Well, stormwater is what we push out into the sound every year from our cars, from our roads, from our parking lots, from our businesses, from our homes. And it's from all of us. I mean, this isn't this isn't one polluter sending out toxics or pollution into the bay. It's all of us. And I think when you look at the Clean Water Act, when that was adopted by Congress in the 1970s, the big problem back then was what was called point pollution. So a big factory was dumping literally thousands of gallons of something into the Hudson or into Lake Michigan or into Puget Sound or into San Diego Bay every year, and you could target that factory and say, clean this up. That was 85% of the problem in the 70s. We've done a really good job of taking care of those point pollution problems. Now what we're dealing with today is non-point pollution. And this is pollution where you can't identify it coming from just one factory or from one location. It's from all of us. And it's a kind of the death by 1,000 cuts. So unfortunately, a lot of the development that's happened in a place like Kitsap County and really throughout the Puget Sound region, if you look at Bremerton, if you look at Silverdale, downtown Kingston, parts of unincorporated Kitsap like Suquamish or Manchester, when these areas were developed and a lot of the houses, businesses, roads that have been in place for decades, when those roads, when those businesses, when those homes were initially built, we didn't have proper stormwater protections in place. And if you drive around Suquamish or Manchester, those are a couple good examples. What kind of stormwater treatment do we have? Well, water comes onto a road, and goes into a ditch, the ditch goes out into the bay. That's it. Silverdale, if you drive down Silverdale Way, if you start up by the post office and drive all the way down to Buckland Hill Road, to Old Town. If you go along that entire stretch of Silverdale Way, you have a massive boulevard, and every few feet you see a stormwater catchment. When Silverdale Way was completed a couple decades ago, all that stormwater from that 5-lane boulevard goes into those catch basements, goes right into an outfall, right into the bay. And along with the water, you have stormwater. And you have pollution, and you have oil, and you have chemicals, and you have toxics. Well, when you add this up throughout the Puget Sound region, there's varying accounts of how much stormwater we're talking about. Some reports say there's 8 million gallons of pollution being sent into the bay, into Puget Sound every year. Some counts are up to 50 million. Well, to me, whether it's 8 million or 50 million or somewhere in between, what we're saying is we have a serious problem. And we know this is a serious problem, and we know it's affecting the health of Puget Sound, because if you just take a look at the top of the food chain, which in Puget Sound are our local orca pods, if you take those resident orcas of Puget Sound, they're among the most toxic living mammals on the planet. And the reason why they have such high levels of toxicity, our local orcas in Puget Sound, is because those orcas eat the salmon eat other fish, and it's that food web that starts at the very bottom and works its way up to the most advanced species in the ecosystem, which are our orcas and humans. And so this is a problem. What we've wanted to do, and I chair the Coastal County Caucus, local governments, counties, cities, we've partnered with the environmental community, we've partnered with the building trades to be able to advance a bill that would set aside about $100 million a year for local governments to use as a competitive grant program in order to implement stormwater improvements. So what that means is that Kitsap County, the city of Bremerton, Bainbridge Island, Paulsboro, Port Orchard will be able to compete for these grant monies And for the county, we can take those grant monies, leverage the money that we're already using locally in our stormwater accounts, and whether it's in Manchester or Suquamish, adding stormwater treatments, whether it's retrofitting Silverdale Way at some point so that it has low impact development, and instead of sending all that stormwater out into the bay, we're retaining it on site, we're infiltrating it with low impact development techniques. We're methodically moving through a process where we're targeting the infrastructure that makes the most sense up front and has the most significant impact, but we're solving the problem. And our message to our legislators and to the state has been, we can have the most comprehensive stormwater restrictions on new development. Fine, that's a conversation that can be had. But if you're just trying to have the most stringent regulations for new development, for a new house or a new business being built, that's not going to solve the problem. Because the problem is the legacy of development that's occurred to date that wasn't done right. And I think if we knew now what we wish we would have known 30 years ago, we probably would have done things differently. But the regulations were different, we thought the problems were different, and now we have a lot of catch-up work. So that's what we're trying to solve. And I was out at a community meeting this past week, meeting with our community advisory councils from Manchester, Suquamish, Central Kitsap, Kingston, and Hansville. And when I asked this group of citizens that are just volunteers trying to provide some input to the commissioners in unincorporated Kitsap, when I asked all these people, and these were the chairs and co-chairs of these committees, what's the big impact or what's the big problem that the county needs to target? The consensus was stormwater.
Stormwater. Wow.
So this is why the county commissioners adopted a water as a resource policy a year ago. We recognize we need to be leaders, and we're stepping up to the plate to do so.
Good. Wow, time flies. We had other topics, but I want you to update animal control and pet licensing. Sure. I've read recently that the county has taken it back. Why did you do that? In a minute or less.
In a minute or less, the county has contracted out animal control with the Humane Society for many years. The Humane Society a couple years ago asked the county to be able to take on animal licensing. And their reason for wanting to do that was to try to provide more resources to the Humane Society to do their job. Recently, we and our staffs, our respective staffs from the county and from the Humane Society have been working on this. The Humane Society has given the program back to the county. So what this means at the end of the day is that animal licensing, what you have to do in unincorporated Kitsap, doesn't change. What changes is who's administering the program. Instead of the Humane Society, it'll be going through our auditor's office, which is what's typical in most counties. And I think at the end of the day, what it will mean is I think we'll be able to be more efficient. Our auditor's office, that's where you go for licensing and registration issues on a number of fronts. I think we're going to be able to deliver the service more efficiently and effectively for the community. We're looking at ways that we can put the service online and automate it. And I think at the end of the day, we'll be able to have a better ability through the auditor's office to administer this program. But this goes in the category of not the commissioners wanting to do more work or having more on our plate. It goes in the category of one of our community partners saying, we just can't do this anymore.
Can't deal with it, yeah.
Believe me, animal licensing is not at the top of any county commissioner's list for tasks to take on. But in the spirit of partnership, it's something that we're going to be doing again. So,
Josh, thanks so much for coming in today and updating us, especially on those good topics of stormwater and the county budget.
Absolutely.
Nice job.
Thank you for your time, and thank you for those of you at home watching the show, and we look forward to seeing you next time on Commissioner's Corner.